The thing about being a Child Protective Services investigator is that everyone assumes you've seen it all, right up until the moment you're standing in an alien courtroom that looks like it was designed by someone with a serious grudge against the concept of ergonomics, watching a custody battle over what appeared to be a litter of sentient houseplants. Detective Laura Blackwood stared at the chaos unfolding in what the Verdanian Empire had generously called a juvenile welfare tribunal, but which looked more like a cross between a greenhouse and a maximum security prison. The young Verdanians, because apparently that's what you called baby tree people with abandonment issues, were currently huddled in what could only be described as the galaxy's most depressing terrarium. "So," she said to her diplomatic escort, a 12-foot-tall walking oak tree whose name translated roughly to root speaker who judges with ancient wisdom. "Let me get this straight. You want me to determine custody of alien children based on what exactly?" The Verdanian official, whose actual name was something that sounded like wind through leaves mixed with the creaking of old wood, rustled his branches in what she was learning meant either deep thought or severe constipation. "The spawn require proper placement within the grove hierarchy," he explained, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from being literally rooted in tradition. "The competing clans have submitted formal claims based on nutrient provision capacity, territorial security ratings, and photosynthetic optimization potential." Laura looked at the spawn, 6 small beings that looked like a cross between children and potted plants, with bark-like skin, leaves for hair, and eyes that held far too much intelligence for something that probably needed to be watered twice a week. "Right," she nodded, pulling out her tablet and trying to ignore the way every Verdanian in the courtroom leaned away from her, like she might spontaneously combust. "And you called me because human child welfare expertise was recommended by the Galactic Council for, what was it again? Objective assessment of juvenile well-being across species barriers," another official explained, his wooden features creaking with what might have been nervousness. "Your species has reputation for unorthodox approaches to child protection." "Unorthodox how?" "You consider the desires of the young to be relevant factors in placement decisions," he said, as if this was either revolutionary or completely insane. Laura stared at him. "You mean you don't ask the kids where they want to live?" The silence that followed was broken only by the soft rustling of leaves and what sounded like several Verdanians having simultaneous existential crises. "The spawn do not have sufficient cognitive development to make such determinations," Root Speaker declared, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of tradition and possibly some very old fertilizer. "Placement decisions are made by adults based on optimal growth conditions and clan status requirements." "Uh-huh." Laura looked at the young Verdanians, who were watching this conversation with expressions that suggested they understood every word and had some very strong opinions about the proceedings. "And how's that working out for you?" "The current placement dispute has been ongoing for 17 seasons, another official admitted. The competing clans have presented extensive documentation regarding their respective qualifications, but consensus remains elusive." 17 seasons, Laura repeated. "These kids have been in limbo for over 4 years while you argue about who gets to adopt them?" "Custody determination is a complex process requiring careful consideration of all relevant factors." "Have you tried asking them what they want?" The rustling that followed sounded like a forest in a hurricane. Several officials actually took steps backward, as if she'd suggested something that violated the laws of physics. "The spawn cannot comprehend the complexities of clan hierarchy, territorial advantages, or long-term growth optimization," Root Speaker explained with the patience of someone talking to a particularly slow child. "They require guidance from mature beings capable of making rational decisions." Laura looked at the young Verdanians again. The largest one, who couldn't have been more than the equivalent of 8 years old, was gently comforting a smaller one who appeared to be crying, which, for tree people, involved a soft rustling sound and what looked like morning dew forming on their leaves. "Right," she said, walking over to the terrarium courtroom thing. "Mind if I talk to them?" "That is highly irregular," Root Speaker protested. "The spawn are not participants in these proceedings. They are the subject matter." "Yeah, well, where I come from, the subject matter gets a say in what happens to them." She knelt down beside the containment area, bringing herself to eye level with the young beings. They looked back at her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness that she recognized from countless human children who'd been through the system. "Hey there," she said softly, using the same tone that had worked with scared kids for the past 15 years. "I'm Laura. I'm here to help figure out where you guys should live. How are you holding up?" The largest one tilted his head, leaves rustling softly. When he spoke, his voice was like wind chimes made of twigs. "The root speakers say we must wait for the clans to decide our fate, but we do not wish to be separated." Laura felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Separated?" "The clans each wish to claim some of us," another youngling explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "They say we will grow stronger in different groves, learn different skills, serve different purposes." "But we are pod siblings," the first one said, reaching out to touch the others with gentle branch fingers. "We grew together. We should stay together." Laura stood up slowly, turned around, and looked at the assembled Verdanian officials with the expression that had made more than one negligent parent reconsider their life choices. "You're planning to split them up," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet fury that preceded very bad days for people who hurt children. "Optimal placement requires consideration of each spawn's individual characteristics and potential," Root Speaker explained. "Clan Deeproot has claimed the two with strongest photosynthetic capacity. Clan Ironbark wishes the one with most robust defensive growth. Clan Swiftleaf desires—" "They're siblings," Laura interrupted. "They want to stay together." "Sibling bonds are temporary biological imperatives," another official said dismissively. "Clan loyalty is permanent and provides superior long-term benefits." "Temporary?" Laura's voice dropped to the tone that had once made a drug dealer confess just to make her stop looking at him. "You think family is temporary?" "Family is clan," Root Speaker stated with absolute certainty. "These spawn will be integrated into proper clan structures, where they will form appropriate bonds with their designated grove siblings." Laura looked at the young Verdanians, who were now holding on to each other with the desperate grip of children who knew adults were about to make terrible decisions about their lives. She looked at the officials, who were discussing these kids like they were livestock to be distributed for optimal breeding purposes. Then she did something that would later cause 3 different species to declare her either a dangerous radical or a prophetic voice of justice, depending on who was writing the reports. She opened the containment area and walked inside. "What are you doing?" Root Speaker demanded, his branches creaking with alarm. "My job," Laura said, settling down among the young Verdanians, who immediately clustered around her like she was the first adult who'd ever treated them like people instead of property. "Which is protecting children from adults who think they know better than the kids themselves what's good for them." That's when the alarms started going off, and Laura realized she might have just accidentally started an interplanetary incident over custody rights. The alarms, as it turned out, weren't because Laura had committed some sort of diplomatic violation by actually talking to the children involved in their own custody case. They were because the Verdanian Child Placement Authority's central computer had just classified her actions as unprecedented juvenile advocacy event Omega, which apparently meant the same thing as someone just broke our entire legal system by treating kids like people. "A what now?" Laura asked, still sitting cross-legged among the young Verdanians, who had decided that the strange human was the first safe thing they'd encountered in months, and were therefore not letting go of her anytime soon. "Unprecedented juvenile advocacy event Omega," Root Speaker repeated, reading from a display that had sprouted from the courtroom floor like a particularly aggressive weed. "Unauthorized adult intervention in juvenile placement proceedings. Potential corruption of clan selection protocols. Immediate containment and analysis required." "I sat down and asked them how they felt," Laura pointed out, gently extracting a small branch hand from her hair. "That's literally what child welfare investigators are supposed to do." "You contaminated the objectivity of the proceedings," a new voice said. Laura turned to see what appeared to be the Verdanian equivalent of a lawyer. More elaborate bark patterns, shinier leaves, and the unmistakable air of someone who charged by the hour and enjoyed it. "The spawn have now been exposed to unauthorized emotional manipulation techniques." Emotional manipulation? Laura's voice carried the kind of incredulity usually reserved for people who claimed the moon landing was fake. I asked them what they wanted. Precisely, the lawyer tree said, his branches rustling with what might have been satisfaction. You introduce the concept that their desires should influence placement decisions. This represents a fundamental corruption of established juvenile welfare protocols. Laura looked around the courtroom at the assembled Verdanians, all of whom were staring at her like she'd just suggested they try breathing underwater. Let me get this straight, she said slowly. You think asking children what they want is bad? Children lack the cognitive capacity to make optimal decisions regarding their own welfare. Another official explained, his wooden features showing what might have been pity for her obvious mental deficiency. This is why mature beings with fully developed root systems make such decisions for them. Based on what criteria? Clan status, territorial advantages, resource allocation efficiency, genetic optimization potential. What about love? Laura interrupted. The silence that followed was so profound that she could hear the soft photosynthetic processes of the young Verdanians around her. Love? Root Speaker repeated, his translator apparently having trouble with the concept. You know, caring about them as individuals, wanting them to be happy, considering their emotional well-being alongside their physical needs. More silence. The kind of silence that suggested an entire courtroom full of highly evolved plant people had just encountered a concept that didn't fit into any of their existing categories. Emotional well-being is a secondary consideration, the lawyer tree said finally. Primary factors are survival optimization and clan advancement potential. And if the kids are miserable? Misery is a temporary emotional state that resolves once proper clan integration occurs. Root Speaker declared with the confidence of someone who had never actually asked a child how they felt about anything. Laura looked down at the young Verdanians, who were listening to this conversation with expressions of growing despair. The smallest one, who couldn't have been more than the equivalent of 6 years old, was making soft rustling sounds that were clearly the plant person equivalent of crying. You know what? She said, standing up with the kind of determination that had gotten her through 15 years of dealing with bureaucratic nonsense. I think we need a second opinion. A second opinion from whom? Root Speaker asked. From someone who actually knows something about child welfare. Laura pulled out her communication device and started scrolling through her contacts. I'm calling in a consultation. With whom? The lawyer tree demanded. The Galactic Council Child Advocacy Division, Laura said, hitting the call button. Because apparently you people need someone to explain to you why splitting up siblings who want to stay together might not be in their best interests. The rustling that followed sounded like an entire forest having a collective panic attack. The Galactic Council does not have jurisdiction over internal Verdanian custody matters, Root Speaker protested. They do when those matters involve potential violations of the Universal Child Welfare Accords, Laura replied, listening to the connection tone. Which, if I'm reading my diplomatic briefings correctly, include provisions about keeping sibling groups together when possible and considering the children's own preferences in placement decisions. The Universal Child Welfare Accords are guidelines, not binding regulations, the lawyer tree said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Yeah, well, let's see what the council thinks about that. The call connected, and suddenly the courtroom was filled with the voice of someone who sounded remarkably like Laura's old supervisor from Child Protective Services, if her old supervisor had been a crystalline being from the Andromeda Galaxy. Galactic Council Child Advocacy Division, this is Coordinator Zixthera. How may I assist you? Hi, this is Detective Laura Blackwood, consulting on a custody case for the Verdanian Empire. I've got 6 sibling children who want to stay together, but the local authorities want to split them up between different clans based on what sounds like eugenics principles. Could you clarify the council's position on sibling separation in custody cases? The pause that followed was filled with what sounded like rapid data processing and possibly some very creative alien swearing. Detective Blackwood, Coordinator Zixthera said finally. Are you telling me that the Verdanian authorities are planning to separate siblings against their will for purposes of genetic optimization? That's exactly what I'm telling you. And have the children's own preferences been considered in this placement decision? They've been told that their preferences are irrelevant because they're too young to understand what's best for them. Another pause. This one sounded like a computer calculating the probability of diplomatic incidents. Detective Blackwood, please inform the Verdanian authorities that the Galactic Council Child Advocacy Division is immediately opening a formal investigation into potential violations of Articles 12, 15, and 23 of the Universal Child Welfare Accords. All custody proceedings are hereby suspended pending review. The courtroom erupted in rustling chaos. Several officials appeared to be hyperventilating, which for tree people involved a lot of frantic leaf fluttering. Root Speaker was making sounds like a forest fire in a windstorm. "This is outrageous," the lawyer tree declared. "The Galactic Council has no authority to interfere in sovereign Verdanian legal proceedings." "Actually," Coordinator Zixthera's voice carried across the courtroom with crystalline clarity, "they do when those proceedings involve potential violations of accords that Verdania signed and ratified 47 years ago. Detective Blackwood, please maintain custody of the children until our investigation team arrives." Laura looked around the courtroom at the panicking officials, then down at the young Verdanians who were staring at her with expressions of hope that broke her heart. "Will do," she said. "How long until your team gets here?" "Approximately 6 hours. And Detective, good work. It's not often we see someone willing to stand up for children's rights in the face of institutional pressure." The call ended, leaving Laura standing in a courtroom full of very angry tree people and 6 very relieved children who were still clinging to her like she was their personal superhero. "Well," she said, looking around at the chaos she'd apparently caused, "this should be interesting." That's when Root Speaker drew himself up to his full 12-foot height and declared that she had just committed an act of war against the sovereign authority of the Verdanian Empire. And that's when Laura realized that protecting children might be about to get a lot more complicated. The Act of War Declaration, as it turned out, was apparently standard Verdanian legal procedure for any situation involving outside interference in their internal affairs, which meant Laura had accidentally joined the ranks of such notorious galactic criminals as the weather satellite that disrupted their seasonal ceremonies, and the tourist who asked for directions during a religious holiday. "An act of war?" Laura repeated, still sitting on the courtroom floor with 6 alien children clustered around her, like she was their personal fortress against bureaucratic stupidity. "Because I called social services? You have violated our sovereign authority over juvenile placement protocols," Root Speaker declared, his branches quivering, with what she was beginning to recognize as the tree person equivalent of righteous indignation. "You have corrupted our youth with unauthorized emotional manipulation techniques. You have summoned foreign powers to interfere in our internal legal proceedings." "I asked some kids how they felt and called someone who might actually know something about child welfare," Laura corrected. "If that's an act of war, your definition of warfare needs some serious work." "The Galactic Council investigation team is already en route," the lawyer tree added, consulting what appeared to be a tablet made of living wood. "This represents an unprecedented breach of our legal sovereignty. The Grove Council has been notified. Emergency sessions are being convened." "Emergency sessions?" Laura asked, gently untangling another small branch hand from her jacket. "Over a custody case?" "Over the first foreign intervention in Verdanian domestic affairs in 3 centuries, Root Speaker corrected. "The implications are staggering. If outside authorities can override our placement decisions based on the emotional preferences of juveniles, the entire foundation of our social structure is threatened." Laura looked around the courtroom, which was now filled with increasingly agitated officials having what appeared to be the plant equivalent of heated arguments. Some were rustling their leaves aggressively. Others were making creaking sounds that probably meant something important in tree person. A few appeared to be literally putting down roots, which she suspected was either a sign of extreme stress or preparation for a very long meeting. "You know what I think?" she said, her voice cutting through the botanical chaos. "I think your social structure might need threatening." The silence that followed was so complete that she could hear individual leaves falling. "Explain," Root Speaker said, his voice carrying the kind of dangerous quiet that preceded either enlightenment or executions. "You've got a system where children are treated like property to be distributed based on economic and genetic factors," Laura said, standing up slowly while making sure the young Verdanians stayed close. "You don't ask them what they want, you don't consider their emotional bonds, and you think splitting up families is acceptable if it serves your political purposes. Our system has maintained social stability for millennia," the lawyer tree protested. "Clan-based placement ensures optimal resource allocation and genetic diversity." "Your system," Laura said, "produces children who are terrified of the adults who are supposed to protect them." She gestured toward the young Verdanians, who were indeed pressed against her like she was the only safe thing in a world full of predators. "Look at them. They're scared. They're desperate. They've been in legal limbo for 4 years while you argue about who gets to own them. And when someone finally asks them what they want, you call it emotional manipulation." "Their desires are irrelevant," Root Speaker stated. "Children cannot comprehend the complexities of—" "Bullshit," Laura interrupted, using a tone that had once made a family court judge reconsider his ruling. "They're scared of being separated from the only family they've ever known. And that's not complex. That's basic psychology." "You do not understand our culture," another official said, his wooden features creaking with what might have been condescension. "Human concepts of family structure do not apply to Verdanian social organization." "Human concepts like, don't traumatize children for bureaucratic convenience?" Laura asked. "Those concepts?" That's when her communication device chimed with an incoming priority message. She glanced at it and felt her eyebrows climb toward her hairline. "Huh," she said. "That's interesting." "What?" Root Speaker demanded. "Message from the Galactic Council. Apparently, news of your custody case has reached other species. The Corvani Empire wants to know if human child welfare methods can help with their pack integration protocols. The Crystalline Collective is asking about individual identity preservation techniques. And something called the Hive Queens is requesting immediate consultation on emotional development optimization." She looked up from her device to find every Verdanian staring at her with expressions ranging from fascination to existential terror. "It seems," she continued, "that the galaxy has been watching your little legal proceeding here. And they want to know if humans can teach them what you're apparently learning right now." "Which is?" the lawyer tree asked, though his voice suggested he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. "That maybe," Laura said, "treating children like people instead of property might actually work better." That's when the courtroom doors burst open, and what appeared to be a diplomatic delegation from half the galaxy poured in, all of them talking at once in languages her translator couldn't keep up with. The delegation included representatives from at least 12 different species, 3 different galactic governments, and what looked like a floating crystal that was probably either a very advanced AI or a very confused mineral formation. They had all arrived simultaneously, which suggested either incredible coordination or the kind of cosmic coincidence that usually preceded universe-ending catastrophes. "Detective Laura Blackwood," announced the lead representative, a tall, elegant being whose translator identified her as Ambassador Keth Mora of the Galactic Child Welfare Standards Committee, which was apparently a thing that existed. "You are under immediate diplomatic protection pending evaluation of the Verdanian Empire's compliance with Galactic Child Welfare Standards." "Diplomatic protection?" Laura asked, still surrounded by young Verdanians who seemed to have decided that the scary human was their best bet for survival. "What am I being protected from?" "From the 17 species that have just declared the Verdanian custody system a violation of basic sentient rights," the ambassador replied with the weary tone of someone whose job had just become infinitely more complicated. "Also from the 6 species that want to study your child advocacy techniques, and the 12 species that want to hire you as their supreme child welfare overlord." Laura looked around the courtroom, which now resembled less a legal proceeding and more a United Nations meeting that had been crashed by a particularly diverse flash mob. "I asked some kids what they wanted," she said weakly. "Yes," Ambassador Kethmora agreed. And apparently that's the most revolutionary child welfare concept the galaxy has witnessed in several thousand years. Root Speaker was making sounds like a forest in a hurricane. This is unacceptable. The Verdanian Empire will not submit to foreign interference in our domestic legal proceedings. Actually, said a new voice from the back of the delegation, one that carried the weight of authority and the kind of gravitas that made everyone else fall silent. You will. The crowd parted to reveal a figure that seemed to command respect through sheer presence. Tall, imposing, with features that suggested both wisdom and the kind of power that could reshape star systems if properly motivated. I am High Arbiter Vexthol of the Galactic Supreme Court, the figure announced. And I have come to inform the Verdanian Empire that their custody practices are now under formal review for potential violations of 17 different galactic accords regarding the treatment of juvenile sentience. Laura looked at the imposing figure, then at the panicking Verdanian officials, then at the young tree children who were still clinging to her like she was their personal shield against bureaucratic insanity. You know what? She said, reaching into her bag and pulling out a pack of tissues. Because even alien children sometimes needed to blow their noses, or whatever the equivalent was for beings with bark for skin. Why don't we all sit down and I'll explain exactly what human child welfare looks like. She held out the tissues toward the smallest Verdanian, who took them with the kind of wonder usually reserved for miraculous artifacts. Fair warning, though, she added with a grin that had once convinced a particularly stubborn judge to actually read the case files. It might just change everything you think you know about protecting children. That's when the young Verdanians decided that the scary diplomatic delegation looked like they could use some hugs too. And that's when the galaxy discovered that some battles are won, not with weapons or laws, but with the simple act of treating children like they matter. What happened when 6 young tree people decided to offer comfort hugs to a delegation of the galaxy's most powerful diplomatic figures was not covered in any legal precedent, child welfare manual, or how to prevent interplanetary incidents guide that Laura was aware of. The fact that said diplomatic figures, who could presumably reshape galactic law with a stray comment, immediately began making what could only be described as pleased purring sounds, was definitely going in her things that shouldn't work but somehow do file. This is unprecedented, High Arbiter Vexthol rumbled, his imposing presence somewhat undermined by the small Verdanian who had decided his robes were perfect for climbing practice. In 4 centuries of galactic jurisprudence, no juvenile beings have approached the Supreme Court with offers of comfort. They're kids, Laura said, as if this explained everything. Kids don't know they're supposed to be intimidated by authority figures. They just see adults who look like they could use a friend. The High Arbiter looked down at the youngling who was now contentedly nestled in the crook of his arm, making soft rustling sounds of happiness. I have presided over the dissolution of empires, he whispered. I have witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, but these young ones, they see only someone who might need kindness. Yeah, well, Laura said, settling back down among the impromptu cuddle pile that now included several very confused diplomatic officials. That's what happens when you teach kids that everyone deserves basic decency, instead of teaching them to fear authority. Ambassador Kethamora was taking notes on a device that looked like it was powered by crystallized good intentions. The implications are staggering. If juvenile beings can be taught to approach authority figures with empathy rather than fear, you get healthier societies, Laura finished. Kids who grow up believing they have a right to be heard, adults who remember that power comes with responsibility, and a system that actually protects the people it's supposed to serve, instead of just perpetuating itself. The assembled galactic representatives were watching this scene with expressions ranging from fascination to the kind of existential crisis that usually preceded major governmental reforms. Root Speaker and his fellow Verdanian officials were huddled in what appeared to be a very intense consultation, making rustling sounds that probably meant either emergency policy revision or complete systemic breakdown. But the practical applications, a crystalline representative chimed, their faceted surface refracting light in patterns that suggested intense concentration. The systematic implementation across multiple species with varying social structures. Start with one simple principle, Laura interrupted. Children are people, not property. Everything else builds from there. But without proper hierarchical placement protocols, Root Speaker protested, his branches quivering with what might have been the last gasps of bureaucratic resistance. How do we ensure optimal resource allocation and social stability? By asking the kids what they need and then actually listening to the answer, Laura replied. Revolutionary concept, I know. High Arbiter Vexthul looked up from the young Verdanian, who was now teaching him what appeared to be a clapping game involving leaves and twigs. Detective Blackwood, he said, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority mixed with something that might have been wonder. Are you suggesting that the foundation of effective child welfare is simplicity? I'm suggesting that the foundation of effective child welfare is giving a damn about the children involved, Laura corrected. Everything else, the laws, the procedures, the bureaucracy, that's all just supposed to support that basic principle. When the system becomes more important than the kids it's supposed to protect, that's when you know you've lost the plot. She gestured around the courtroom, which now looked less like a legal proceeding and more like the galaxy's most diverse playgroup. Look at them. 6 kids who've been trapped in your legal system for 4 years, scared and confused and desperate to stay together. And the moment someone actually asked them what they wanted and took their answer seriously, everything started working better. The human makes a compelling argument, observed a representative from what appeared to be a hive mind species, their multiple voices speaking in harmony. Perhaps our collective child-rearing protocols could benefit from individual preference consideration. The Corvani pack integration ceremonies could be modified to include juvenile choice elements, added another delegate, whose lupine features showed what might have been thoughtful consideration. Even the machine consciousness could implement emotional preference algorithms in our offspring development programs, contributed what was definitely an AI housed in a mobile crystalline matrix. Laura looked around the room at the assembled representatives, all of whom were staring at 6 young tree children like they were witnessing the birth of a new form of civilization. You know what's really funny about all this? She said. What? High Arbiter Vexthul asked, still being used as a jungle gym by his new leafy friend. On Earth, this isn't revolutionary. This is just Tuesday. We've known for decades that kids do better when they have a voice in decisions that affect them, when they're kept with siblings when possible, when their emotional well-being is considered alongside their physical needs. The silence that followed was profound. You mean, Ambassador Kethamora said slowly, that human child welfare practices have already solved these problems? Not solved, Laura corrected. We're still working on it. But we figured out a long time ago that treating children like people instead of property generally produces better outcomes for everyone involved. And you would be willing to share these practices with other species? The High Arbiter asked. Laura looked at the young Verdanians, who were now contentedly settled among the various diplomatic officials like they'd found their perfect family. She looked at Root Speaker, who was having what appeared to be a very serious conversation with his colleagues about the possibility that their entire legal system might need some adjustments. She looked at her communication device, which was now showing incoming requests from dozens of species across the galaxy. Well, she said, I suppose someone should teach you all how to run a proper child welfare system. 6 months later, Laura stood in what had once been the Verdanian Empire's Central Custody Tribunal and was now the Galactic Center for Child Welfare Innovation. The original courtroom had been expanded 47 times to accommodate what the media had dubbed the Great Galactic Childhood Rights Revolution. The facility now housed the first interspecies child advocacy training program, where representatives from over 300 species were learning the radical concept that children's opinions mattered in decisions about their own lives. The original 6 Verdanian younglings had been adopted together by a mixed-species family that included 2 Corvani, a crystalline collective node, and a very patient AI that had developed what could only be described as parental instincts. Status report? Asked Director Williams, her former supervisor who had somehow found himself running the galaxy's most important child welfare facility while still complaining about paperwork and budget constraints. Well, Laura said, watching a young hive queen larva teach a group of warrior clan hatchlings how to resolve conflicts through negotiation instead of combat. The good news is we've prevented 23 potential custody disasters by teaching alien bureaucrats that children are people. And the bad news? Laura looked around the facility, at the dozens of species whose child welfare systems had been completely overhauled based on human principles. at the parents who had learned that listening to their children produced better outcomes than ignoring them, at the growing network of similar facilities being built across the galaxy, at her appointment schedule, which now included consultations with beings from parallel dimensions who had heard about human child advocacy methods. The bad news is, we've accidentally created the most successful civil rights movement in galactic history, and now everyone wants their kids to have human-style legal representation. Later that evening, Laura found herself in the original courtroom, now converted into a quiet study space where young beings from across the galaxy could do homework together. High Arbiter Vex Thul, who had become the facility's unofficial evening supervisor and bedtime story reader, was helping a small entropy lord with what appeared to be mathematics homework. "Any regrets?" asked Root Speaker, who had undergone what he called philosophical root restructuring, and was now one of the galaxy's most passionate advocates for children's rights. Laura considered this. 6 months ago, she'd been a simple Child Protective Services investigator, dealing with the usual challenges of bureaucratic nonsense and adults who forgot that children were people. Now she was apparently the galaxy's unofficial minister of making sure everyone treats kids like they matter. From somewhere in the facility, she could hear the sound of a dozen different species children working together on a project, their various forms of laughter and collaboration creating a harmony that no computer could replicate and no legal system could mandate. "Ask me again in 20 years, Laura said, watching the High Arbiter successfully explain fractions to a being made of living mathematics. "When we see whether we've saved the galaxy's children, or accidentally taught the universe how to be a family." In her final report to the Galactic Supreme Court, High Arbiter Vex Thul wrote, "Recommendation. The humans have demonstrated that the most powerful force in the universe is not law, military might, or even judicial authority. It is a Child Protective Services investigator with a clipboard, and the radical belief that children deserve to be heard. This approach has single-handedly revolutionized galactic child welfare standards, prevented countless custody disasters, and fundamentally altered our understanding of what justice means when applied to the most vulnerable members of society. However, it has also made humans indispensable to galactic civilization in a way that should probably concern us more than it does. They have conquered us all through the simple expedient of treating our children better than we do. Further observation required, but from a safe distance. Also, my own offspring have started asking when they can attend human school, and I find myself disturbingly eager to enroll them." The report was filed under Humanity, Approach with Caution and Adequate Legal Representation for Minors. A handwritten note was attached. "We came to judge their methods. Instead, they taught us that the strongest thing you can give a child isn't rules or structure. It's the knowledge that their voice matters." The young Verdanians no longer lived in legal limbo, and the galaxy had learned that some rights, like the right to be heard, the right to stay with your family, and the right to be treated with dignity, truly are universal. And in the end, that was the most revolutionary discovery of all. Because once you teach a child that they matter, they grow up to build a universe where everyone does.